More Baudrillard. So we were talking about this idea about, kind of like the real, the hyperreal, like simulations of things, right? And so I want to go, he has a really clear chart on page 748 about the successive phases that he sees within simulacra. So I want to talk through that and then, or I want to read his words and then talk through it a little bit. So he starts 747. So it is with simulation insofar as it is opposed to representation. Representation starts from the principle that the signs and the real are equivalent, even if this equivalence is utopian. It is a fundamental axiom. Conversely, simulation starts from the utopia of this principle of equivalence, from the radical negation of the sign as value, from the sign as reversion of death sentence for every reference. This would be the successive phases of the image. First, it is a reflection of the basic reality. 2, it masks and perverts a basic reality. 3, it masks the absence of a basic reality. And 4, it bars no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. And so if we're thinking about this, like with the pumpkin spice latte that I was using in the last example, right? The reflection of the basic reality would be if we had a pumpkin drink and Starbucks sold us a pumpkin drink, right? The mask and perversion of the basic reality would be if we had the pumpkin drink and they gave us some kind of like pumpkin pie syrupy drink without any real pumpkin in it that was like a masking of that. Phase 3 was where we talked about where it masks the absence of a basic reality, right? So this idea that like fall is pumpkin spice season, even though there never was pumpkin spice, like it was something that was created by Starbucks, right? So this idea that they fed us this thing to tell us like, hey, remember this is part of our fall celebration, even when it was this thing that they made up in the first place, right? However, it is still a drink at this point by Starbucks, right? And it is still kind of a part of, this, something that you can tangibly hold, like, and it is supposed to represent a drink. To stage 4, where it bars no relation to any reality whatsoever, right? And this is like how in the last, it might be over, I don't know, but a few years ago, people were using like PSL as like a derogatory term to be like hurled at quote unquote basic women, right? So like put on your vest and your Uggs and your leggings or whatever and have your PSLs or whatever. And so it was this idea that like it became this representation of whiteness, right? Of affluent, privileged, cisgendered, feminine whiteness, right? And like that doesn't connect then to anything. It doesn't connect to like a fall celebration. It doesn't connect to harvest, right? It doesn't connect to any of the things that maybe originally the PSL was supposed to link to any signal, right? But it's just the sign without any value, right? It's like this representation of something, but that something isn't real. And so, right? Like in the sense that like Baudrillard becomes the anti-Marxist. This is straight up pessimism, right? Like we are marching forward to a life where we progress, but there is no foundation to anything. There is no reality that we hitch it to. It's real bad. Right? So he uses Disneyland as another example of this. So on page 748, he starts talking about, to begin with, it is a play of illusions and phantasms. The objective profile of the US may be traced through Disneyland, even down to the morphology of individuals in the crowd. All of its values are exalted here in miniature and comic strip form, embalmed and pacified. Later in column 2 on 748, Disneyland is presented as an imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, when in fact all Los Angeles and the America surrounding it are no longer real either, but the order of the hyperreal and of simulation. It is no longer a question of a false representation of reality, ideology, but concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus the saving the reality principle. And so, Disneyland, he argues, was set forth to kind of have this celebration of real American values. But there isn't that anymore, right? We can think about like all of the different cultural fracturings that we have, political polarization, right? Like class fragmentation, all of these kinds of things are separating us. The decline of religion. I mean, like you could just go on and on for all these kinds of things that like are shifting our ideologies to where there is no like kind of like wholesome America anymore, right? That perhaps maybe at best we're a culture of subcultures, but we don't have any like monoculture, right? And so again, Disneyland is supposed to be the celebration of it, but it doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist in the gates of Disney, and it doesn't exist in LA or anywhere in the United States. And so, it's mass-produced clothing, milled knowledge, factory manufactured housing, right? It is neither true, that Disneyland imaginary is neither true nor false, he says on page 748. It is a deterrence machine set up in order to rejuvenate and revere the fiction of the real, right? And revel in this. And so it only exists for us to pretend like there is something that is meaningful, right? There is nothing that is meaningful. So we have this celebration within the simulation in these imaginary stations, he calls them. But again, it doesn't represent anything that exists outside. And so, that's why in terms of thinking about parody, right? Like every once in a while, you'll see like people cite The Onion as if it is real, right? Or other satirical news sites, right? Like asking, kind of like putting forth this idea like that this is this real thing. Well, we can't know what satire is anymore, right? Because we don't have a reality. It is just as dangerous that we're responding to things that we think of as being real, right? We punish threats that are not necessarily threatening. Like I think about the first time I ever kind of like truly taught Baudrillard in a theory class was right on the heels of Tamar Rice being shot by police, right, and murdered because they believed he had a real gun when he had a fake gun, right, and like there is no opportunity for people, particularly Black men, to have fake guns in public anymore, right? Because we can think about like after Tamir Rice, case after case after case of people being murdered by the police because they were perceived as especially Black men, right, being murdered by the police because they're perceived as having like a real weapon that isn't, right, or even a perceived weapon and it isn't even a fake weapon at all, right? It's just this kind of like this falsehood, right? And so, for, like if we're thinking about this in terms of race, the real reason that the police can overreact to Black bodies is that they're protecting the simulation of Black inclusion in our country where there is no reality to that claim, right? That there is, again, this society of white supremacy, and that's like what underlies it. And so it all just gets like terribly perversified, right? Like over and over again. Power itself eventually breaks apart in this space and becomes a simulation of power, disconnected from aims and objectives and dedicated to power effects in mass simulation, he says on 750, right? And so no one can have power, right? Because everything's fake and made up. And so like it just becomes simulation. And so again, like a lot of Baudrillard theorists right now are talking about like the militarization of the police or like excessive shows of force, right? By, like posting security guards everywhere, like, so we have security guards everywhere, even though companies don't really care about shoplifting, right? Or, like, so you go into Target again, like we're talking about my Target, you go into Target, there is this surveillance, and these security forces there, but like they don't stop anybody for shoplifting, right? It's all farce. And so like in Baudrillard's, right, he says, and again, like, like what just crushing pessimism on page 751, when it is threatened today by simulation, the threat of vanishing in the play of signs, power risks the real risk crisis. It gambles on manufacturing artificial social, economic, political stakes. This is the question of life or death for it, but it is too late, right? And so in his world, in his belief, the simulation has won, right? Like we are living in the matrix, quote unquote, and that is what it is, right? So there is no coming back from it. There's no way to reattach to anything that is meaningful or real. We're stuck, right? And I wish I had a better ending, but Baudrillard is not at all positive about what is happening in modern society and beyond. Mindless consumerism.